everyone who's coming today for our fourth Coffee with a Legend. And we specifically want to thank Chaz and the Black Cat Bookstore volunteer staff who allow us to come here and help get this set up and offer this space at no charge, and it's a nice kind of win-win for everybody. And that I also would like to thank those who have promoted the series, and also the Geronimo Springs Museum, which we're affiliated with this history series. The previous three groups of Coffee with a Legend are now on YouTube, so Geronimo Springs Museum History Club, I think, will find you the channel. And we've got flyers around town about the walks. TRC History Club. Okay, thank you, Jim. TRC History Club. And so I want to take this moment and introduce our legend for today. Really doesn't need any introduction, as have most of our people, but I will say this, is that Sherry Fletcher was born and raised here. She's a historian par excellence for the town and the county in southern New Mexico, and I forgot to grab my books, but she's been the writer of 4 of the local Images of America series books on TRC in Sierra County and the Elephant Butte Dam.
Sierra County, Truth or Consequences, Elephant Butte Dam, and Hatch Valley.
Hatch Valley, okay. And they are, I think they're all for sale here at the bookstore too. They're great. If you want to do a crash course on local history, it's the way to do it very quickly and easily. So without saying anything more, here's Sherry Fletcher. Thanks, Sherry.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel like I'm going to be tied to this, and that's probably good. But anyway, what we're going to talk about today is the truth or the book on Truth or Consequences, and what I have are some images of where the river actually went, because at one time this was all swamp, and the river was then changed. In 1934, there was a flood that pushed the river into the existing channel as we know it today. And so what Cindy Carpenter, who is also the author of the book, when we started working on this, it was like, well, how did Truth or Consequences come to be, and where was it, and why was it where it was? Well, what we found out that up in the Main Street area, there was a bunch of the older buildings, and then the lower buildings, when we started getting to the abstracts, we found that they were really started in the late 20s. And prior to that, like we had the abstracts on our property down on the corner of Maher and Broadway, and that was all part of the Ladder Ranch. So it was all cattle country, and that's what my mother always told me, and I just found that really hard to believe. But after I read the abstracts, then it made a lot more sense to me, that the whole area down there was obviously, grown, there was cattails, and it was grown up, very similar to what we see down now off of Austin and Gray and some of the streets down there that are closer to the river. There was a lot of undergrowth there, and so the cattle could stay there, and they were pretty wild. So with that in mind, and with the abstracts in mind that from my mother, we started working on acquiring pictures for the books. And we found that with the pictures, we used a lot of her pictures, and then we used a lot of pictures from Laverne Charles. And Laverne Charles was an engineer at the dam, and he was and his documents showed up on eBay. He had died. He was in Denver. He died, and they were selling his estate. And so the person, and you may know him, he has Dust and Glitter, Mo, up in Dust and Glitter. He contacted me and he said, well, where was Ingle Dam? And I said, Ingle Dam? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, Ingle Dam was the precursor name for Elephant Butte Dam. So there was Ingle Dam, and then at one time there was Woodrow Wilson Dam, and then they settled on the name of Elephant Butte Dam. And you can't take the dam and the lake out of the context of the water that came out of Colorado, because then we start wondering, well, whose water is it anyway? And that was what led us to the second book, which talked about the water and who owns it. Because you have EBID, which is the Elephant Butte Irrigation District, and they have 60,000 water holders, and they're all down the valley. And so they all play a part in how well all the parts work together. And sometimes they don't work together very well, and that's okay. I mean, because the whole state of New Mexico has had its issues as far as looking at, whose land belongs to who. And for those of you that may or may not know, 63% of the land in Sierra County is owned by the federal government, by BLM, and about 18% is owned by the Forest Service. So you have a whopping, out of an area about 3,600 miles, you have roughly 80% of the land owned by either the Forest Service or the federal government. And so you have a very small sliver of land then owned privately. And I don't think that sometimes people really think about the fact that they don't own the land. And the question then, if you don't, if you don't own the land and you don't own the water, then what do you own? Because in New Mexico, you can sell your water rights and you can sell your land. So, and you have to go back and look at your abstract to see if it's been attached or not, if the water rights are given up. And that's what I did down there where we are down on Broadway. I was curious about, did my mother ever sell those water rights? And those were sold before she ever bought the property. And so you have a lot of wheeling and dealing that happened in New Mexico by large ranch holders. And they could move water rights. They sat on boards, and they were in the know about who was needing what for what. So with that being said, this is an early picture of what the area looked like, and I love that picture, of what the area looked like before they ever started building the dam. And you've got, and of course you all know that, may I move? Okay. You all know that the Caldero, which is the Elephant Butte, is actually a burned out, is a volcanic land formation. And it's in the background there. And this picture was taken before there was ever any water there. So, oops, can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can see where the roads coming in were obviously dirt with rock. And I was always amazed at the fact that the railroad never came this way. The closest the railroad came was Ingle. And then Ingle is out, which is about 20 miles east of TRC. Going down 3rd Street and then on out beyond the dam and then keep on moving. It's out that way. So that's where the railroad is, and that's a story. That's a story into itself. What the decision was made. Again, it was the large landowners that decided where they wanted the railroad to go. And at that time, we didn't become a town. We didn't become incorporated until about 1916. And so, this was all happening prior to that. Are there any questions up to this time?
Yeah, when was it incorporated? 1916 or 60?
1916. Any questions?
And that was like Palomas Hot Springs?
Well, Palomas Hot Springs was south of town.
It's covered up by the lake.
Well, it's
now,
south of
right?
town.
Oh.
Yeah, and then what they did was, there's Tina. This is Tina. She just finished her PhD, and she's going to help today. She doesn't know it, but she's going to help. That's okay. So anyway, we're glad that she came in from Albuquerque. So, but Palomas Hot Springs would be south of town, where there's Palomas, and there was a town there, and that town was there before they ever started draining the swamp up here, and then they moved it up here, and Otto Getz was the one that said, we need to drop Palomas. So they dropped and they just went with the name of the town of Hot Springs. Okay? That's a good question, Patty.
Well, I've seen it boating before, of those depth finders of when the water was covering
Right.
things out there.
And
so.
and that was closer. You have to realize that that was all closer to the Black Range, and really what brought people into the area was the minerals and the mining. And so you had Hillsboro, and you had Lake Valley, and you had lots of the areas that were up in the mountains that were doing mining. But as the mining petered out, and the gold and the silver was no longer as attractive as it was at that time, then water became the main throw, and then people began to look at, developers came into the area. So the area was really developed by developers, and they were also pushing the water issue, the hot water. And you have to realize the medical issues that were going on. We had the even in the 30s. In the 30s, we had the onset of polio, and that brought in then Carrie Tingley Hospital, and that was Clyde Tingley, and his wife had polio, and he came from the Midwest, and his wife was pretty stoved up and moved out here to Albuquerque, and they found that the waters really helped. So along with that created an opportunity then for this area to be developed as well. Okay?
And wasn't there diphtheria also? Did people with diphtheria come here also?
Tuberculosis.
Tuberculosis?
Yeah, tuberculosis. They were coming here, and tuberculosis was something they needed the dry climate, and the dry climate was obviously represented here, so that was good. So let me see. I know I can't. Tina, can you get me my books over there, please? Because I'm going to kind of use the. Thank you. I would like to thank everybody because all of our books have gone hardcover. And yeah, and when I called Arcadia, I said, okay, I'm learning this area as I go along. And I said, I don't understand why some of the books are like Sally, right? Sally here is holding a paperback book, and I said, what's the difference? And she said, well, that meant that the people bought 2,500 of the soft cover, and then that led to the hardcover. So all of you that bought our books, thank you very much. We really appreciate that. That was This is the book on Elephant Butte Dam, and this is the book on Hatch Valley. And of course, it was ironic because when Cindy and I started, we did this book, and we had the idea about the book, but then it really didn't. They turned us down. And I called and I kept saying, well, Arcadia has published 9,400 books. Probably by now it's close to 10,000 books on communities. Why is it that our community is not going to be included? Well, they kept putting us off, and I'm like a bull in a china closet. I wouldn't give up. And so finally, they called Cindy and they said, we've accepted the manuscript. We kept reworking it, sending it back, and reworking it, and sending it back. And so that was a whole challenge into itself because everything was uploaded from our computers to a hard drive and sent to South Carolina. And so that was this one. And then we did the last one with Sierra County. And it was amazing. And I love some of the images in this one because they show then building the actual dam and the old vehicles that were used. And if you go out to dam site now, you can see some of the beautiful stone walls, the work that's there, or go up on top where the park is, and you can see the beautiful walls that are there. And, it's just worth a walk in history to see all the work that has been done in those areas there. So with the building of the dam, and we always, that changed the whole course then. After the dam was completed, the big thing, and I could be wrong, because I've been wrong before, but the big thing was that the workers, there were about 5,300 workers on Elephant Butte Dam. That was a lot of workers. And because it was a federal project, they did not allow alcohol on the property. Well, you know where the alcohol was offered here.
The
And
basements
so-
were the stills, I was told.
Yeah, and so the workers would come here and have a good time on the weekends, and that continued, and so, that really is how we got our start in 1916. That was after the completion of the dam. So, some of the pictures. This was a document that was taken by the Albuquerque Journal, and it was the 100th anniversary of the dam. And so there were lots of people that showed up to walk across the dam because at 9/11, they stopped traffic going across the dam. And I think any major dam, Hoover Dam, they all stopped the traffic because of what had happened with the bombing in New York. So, but this was a picture that the Albuquerque Journal photographer took, showing all the people that were enjoying the dam that particular day.
Is that in the book?
Huh?
Is that picture
No,
in the
the
book?
picture's not in the book because the book was published in 2008, and the dam had its birthday in 2016, so it was about 5 years ago. The big thing that I always found amazing when we were looking at this is kind of what the area looked like before they started filling the water. And you can see the individuals out on that point, and it was preparing the land. And of course, little did they know that as they prepared the land there, and as the course of the water changed, that was going to change the entire area in here and allow people to move in. This is a document showing what it looked like over there by, and this had to be out there by Dirt Dam. And I don't know if you're familiar with the lake, but you go up, you go out 3rd Street, and then when you get to the Y there, you turn to the left and you go up on top, and then you can see, when you look now, you can only walk because they have it blocked off, but now you can see the rocks that are there. And I can remember as a kid, when they paved all this area, because I was in and out of Hot Springs. I was probably a typical student that I'd get in trouble, and my mother would send me back to my grandmother, and my grandmother would straighten me out, and then I'd come back down here. And then, and apparently my grandmother, it worked because I ended up going the straight and narrow when I went to college. But it was amazing when you look at this about how, I look at this and I think about, well, I got hit by a car out there. That's what I remember, partying out there and got hit by a car. So anyway, but that's what the area looked like there. And this was some of the building that was going on. And it's amazing when you think about the fact that, here, Tita, just pull that up, there you go. That it was amazing when you think about the fact that they did so much of this was just with horses. I mean, it was just amazing. And I have been in contact with a young lady. I've been in contact with a young lady in Amarillo, and her great grandfather worked on the dam. So I'm looking to get some more documentation about the dam, so that we could write maybe another volume to this book here, because I think that it is so interesting to have firsthand knowledge, and we're working on that. And I don't know, sometimes it's a slow process when you're trying to get old documents from people because they haven't filed away. Yes, ma'am.
Could you drive across the dam originally before
Yes.
they closed it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could drive across the dam. That's right. And now what you can do is you can walk. I mean, you could walk at that time. I don't know. Like I said, we walked across the dam about 3 weeks ago. They had
On
no.
January 1st.
That was the 1st of January.
Yeah.
They had so that was about 6 weeks ago. The 1st of January, they had the state parks opened it up for the day. because again, it's what is interesting about the whole area is that who owns the dam, and then getting permission from the dam, because who owns the dam and who owns the water, and then who owns the land around the water, they're all owned by separate people. And so you've got to get all those entities working together, and they managed to do that when they opened up the dam and they had to walk across the dam. What I find another thing that was interesting in here is you can see the railroad tracks. When they had the railroad tracks, well, doggone it. When they had the
Turn the
railroad
music
tracks,
off that's coming through the speaker.
huh?
There's music
Oh.
coming through the speaker. I thought you should turn it off.
And you know, there's this here was a Bureau reclamation document that they had where they would allow the trains and the wagon bridges to cross over to bring the different supplies into the town of Hot Springs. Here was an example, and they tore so many of these old bridges down. Like there was a bridge over there at Ash Canyon that crossed the water. But now, my husband and I walk that, and I can find where the stubs are, but they've torn it all down. So it's so typical of what would have happened at that time, where items would have been torn down and then reused, and rather than just being left there, the railroad tore it down and used it for something else. I love this picture here at the top because it shows the first, and this would have been on page 18. It's the first community of building of the dam, and that was from Annette Smith. And I don't know if any of you knew Annette Smith or not, but her and her brother. Did you know Annette? Yep. She was a very special lady, and I spent hours with her in her home interviewing her because she had come down here with her brother, and she took the baths, and she went to high school here and graduated in 1946. So it was just amazing, when you looked at her age, and she was like 20 when she graduated, but it was amazing, and having her talk about the memories. And when we located the pictures, and then I took the pictures to Annette, and she'd go, "Oh yeah," and she'd just start talking. Well, we would start videoing that, or we would start doing a cassette tape, so we had the documents. So when we went back and we wrote it, then we could actually have her words. That was what was in there. Herbert Yeo, and I don't know if any of you know, he was really an individual from Santa Fe, and he was an engineer on the dam, and his documents were very well received, and he shows and talks about doing the structural the structural engineering of the dam and of the roads around the dam when they started building that. And this is, I asked my mother, I said, how did they build the dam with the water always running? I mean, that was to me a question and she'd say, well, they pushed it aside. You don't push the Rio Grande aside. Well, we found this picture, and the picture shows how, and this was in, I think this was not Annette's, this was in Laverne Charles's work, but you can see how they pushed the dirt aside, and then they started building, and after they started the building, then they worked the other side until eventually they had the whole area stopped. And you hear all these stories about, there's bodies in the dam. Well, there could never be bodies in the cement. I mean, let's get real, because you couldn't have a vacuum there. And so, it was amazing the stories that people heard, and then we went out, Cindy and I would go out and say, okay, we got to figure out who is living, or how do we find out whether that really happened or not, because stranger things have happened to your sea. So anyway, but no, number one, there are no bodies in the dam, and number two, The only individual that, and Cindy and I, we flew to Denver and looked at the documents up there. There was one individual that drowned down here off of Riverside before it was ever Riverside. Drowned in the river there because he got drunk and fell in the lake, fell in the river and drowned. And that led me to the question of, well, how did we get Riverside? I mean, you start wondering, the names of the streets, where did they come from, and how did they start? And Broadway, which we all know about Broadway, that was really called Hobbs Avenue, because Hobbs was a developer. And so then we started thinking, well, where did the words come from? Where did the names come from? Well, they came from developers, is what we found. That as we started categorizing them in a piece of, a large piece of chart paper, that again, it was coming up with, they were coming with the names of developers. These are examples of how they drilled into the granite. And B.M. Hall, who worked for the President of the United States, it was also the Bureau of Reclamation. There was lots of conflict at the time about where this dam was supposed to be, and some wanted it down by Las Cruces, some wanted it by Hatch, and then he made the selection. B.M. Hall made the selection that the dam, that the actual building of the dam needed to be here because of the sandstone and because of the rock that was there. That it was a natural area that could be easily enclosed and would be strong. And so I often asked my mother, when the lake would be so high, I'd say, well, do you think it's going to break? I mean, I was trying to be a realist here. My mother would say, no, it's not going to break. And I'm going, well, I just felt better when the water level dropped and there was not so much pressure on that dam but again, it's the stone that protects the community and protects us and everybody downstream. Because can you imagine what would happen if it would be, we talk about the earthen dams that have broken back on the Mississippi River. I mean, so, it could really be a mess. I can't even imagine. I mean, I know I'd be dead. I don't know about anybody else. Because it'd be like, I just watch it come. Originally, there was only 1 8-hour shift, but as they hurried and tried to get the dam from going, then they moved it to 2-hour shifts and 3-hour shifts, so they were working around the clock. So, with that being said, TRC really took off as Columbus Hot Springs, because after the dam was built, then there was a decision then to move the community up into this area here, because they found that there was the hot springs, and some of the springs were here, and they might cover and uncover based on the flow of the river. And so when people say, oh no, the spring over there by the museum, it's always been there, and I'm going, yeah, right. Somebody's going to walk over there to the spring in mud up to your neck to know there's hot water there. Come on, get real. Let's get real. Think about this. Instead of just carrying on these tales, let's really listen and think about what we're saying. Because at that time, again, it was the course of the river changed and the water dropped, and then the springs came out and they could see the steam. So that was how we got hot springs. And then when they moved the community up here, because obviously it couldn't be down in the mouth of Palomas, and they moved it up here. They dropped the name Palomas and just called it Hot Springs.
Sherry, what year did the river shift?
Huh?
What year did the river make that big shift?
Not 1934.
Okay.
Yeah. So, any questions up to now? I'm seeing a lot of confusion. I hope I'm trying to clarify that. Yes.
Back to the dam construction. One of the urban myths that's in town is that the little shacks that were used for housing up there were floated down the river. What's your opinion on that?
I don't. You know, I have looked at that. I mean, have looked for documents to show where they were, and Tita, you've done your PhD on that. You want to respond to
Yeah,
that?
I do. I actually came up with a word, just fun dissertation sort of stuff, called topofabula, topo being earth and fabula being a fable, about these sort of stories that spring up as like the true and real history of places. And one of them, and Sherry and I have gone back and forth on this, was on the houses. Houses don't actually float. You build huge barges to float houses down. And so I talked to an engineering company who said, well, one, you would have to build a pretty enormous structure, boat, to move the houses. And so Sherry and I have talked about having an annual house floating competition. Just so people could build something small and they could see the impossibility, the utter impossibility of actually floating. What Sherry did discover is a lovely picture of the house being put on a wagon.
Yeah, and I've got a picture, and that's what I'm looking for. I've got a picture in here showing, because that was one of the questions that we really felt.
We went after that for months and months just to see if there could actually, if it could have been a possibility. And we kind of came to the conclusion, I mean, of course, that had somebody floated one of those houses, it would have been photographed, because it would have been such a feat. It would have definitely been on a boat, and the cost of building a boat to float one house would have been exorbitant. When you could just take a wagon up, which most people did, and lift it, or just take the houses apart, which most people also did, and put them on a wagon and move them. And so the cost and the sort of the risk, you know, the risk of putting, so that when you float houses on a river, there is a considerable risk, and there's a huge payoff. So they've done it for a couple like beautiful Victorians, and but for that would have been. I mean, people wouldn't put. It would have been more. It would have cost more to do that than the houses were worth.
Right.
So, but people love the idea of it, and they do. They love the idea of houses float. There's something very magical and exciting about the idea of a house floating. You know, down from up above and floating into town, and so I think that people really love the idea of it. But I do think an annual house floating
And you know,
competition
with so many people living in tents like this, is like, then they talk about, you know, they really. When the stories that get told, well, you know, they lived in fancy housing. Well, when you look at the tents, you know, I mean, it'd be highly unlikely that they would have the wood to have floated down the river. Now, there was one hotel here, the Vera, that they're supposed to have been, but, you know, again, when they tore the top roof off, there was no documentation to show that the wood had been waterlogged. So again, it sounds good. I mean, can you imagine floating that large building right there down the river? I mean, come on. You know, think about it. You know, so. And I'm looking here. You can see some of the buildings like this still out around the lake. That would have been the doctor's office with the nice picket fence around the area where they would have set up. Because again, with TB coming in, that people needed to lay out in the sun. And that was one of the ways that they did it, was they had the veranda. And if you drive down Main Street, you can see some of the 2-story verandas where people would lay out in the sun, and you know, that would make them feel better. I was looking for a picture, and I don't know which book it's in, but it's about showing how they were dismantling the cabins, or dismantling the buildings. And Tina, can you help me look for that, please? It's not. Check that one out, would you please? And see if because it's a man with a wagon and a horse.
I know it well.
This is what the lake looked like in about 1953. And you can see where they had the stone buildings that were there. This was in front of This would have been, this is August the 6th, 1954. And this is the date that we took out of the, and this is in the Elephant Butte Dam book, but this is the, did you find it?
Yeah.
This is that's the date when the lake was at an all-time low. Yeah, here we go. See how, and I'll pass this around. You see how here they were, when Ingle Dam was completed in 1916, the government sold off the buildings at the site. Some were taken apart and removed by horse. And so I think it's the confusion there. Will you pass it around? I think the confusion there is that when they started using the terms that they used, that people thought that the actual structure was a building, and it may have been like a tent city, because the only thing we could find, which would be the tent city, and then of course this document here in 1954, where you find the actual, you see the stones there, that it was below. The lake was at an all-time low, below 12,000 acre feet. And when I asked my mother about that, I remembered it, but what I remember was just the smell of dead fish. That was what I remembered. And my mother said, "Oh, we were catching all these fish out there, because the lake had just, had just dried up." So I think that was a pretty special picture right there, of what it looked like with that.
A new topic. Over near there, Ralph Edwards Park, there's the rocks that have the holes that are claimed to be Native American grinding holes. Can you talk about that? Just to me, it's questionable, because they look more like they're volcanic tubes. They're very big, and they're not like any other grinding holes I've ever seen.
Well, that's interesting that you have noticed those. When I was principal at the alternative school, the kids would go over there, and I walked all over those rocks, chasing kids back to school, But what we found interesting, here, I'll let you pass that around. What is interesting about that would be that if you had your early cultures, they may have used that as grinding stones, and they may be a lot older than what we think. So, they don't leave any history. So, we don't know. Again, it would have, the grinding stone, the water would have had to have been around, had to move around those stones, and the stones had to have been out of the water. So, that's a good question, and I don't think that we've been able to, come up with that. I mean, there's a lot of hypothetical ideas about that, but we really don't know. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
This is not on that topic, but if the river changed course in 1934, why did that happen? Because the dam was already there.
Would you say that again?
Yeah, you said that the river changed course in 1934.
Down here.
Down here.
Yeah, not up there.
Yeah, but why? Since the dam was already there, what made the river change its
A flood.
course? A flood.
Yeah, the flood. And we all know how water can change the course of a stream.
Yeah.
And if any of you have ever been out in a flood and watched it, I mean, like go to the head of it and watch, you never know which way it's going to go. So it would have been the flood that would have changed the course and pushed the river over, and then all the other water started following it.
So was that coming over the dam at that
No.
point?
No, it was not water over the dam. That's a very good question. It would have been water coming in from Cachio Creek,
Okay.
and coming from the streams from the lower
So all the water was coming this side of
below. Yeah, this side of below the dam.
south of the dam.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So where was it in 1934 that it changed from, or was it
What you
before?
say?
Where did the river change the course from and to?
Well, at that time, it was all out in this area out in here.
But these buildings are older than that, aren't they?
Well, no. We have the abstract on our building, which is down on the corner of Marr and Broadway. And down on Marr and Broadway, at that time, that was all part of the Ladder Ranch. And I've got the abstracts on that. The abstracts go back to 1886.
So this was all underwater at one point?
Yeah.
And then,
It was just a swamp. And it may have dried out just like the river does now. You know, it would dry out, and there might be dry spots, and then it would flood, and then there wouldn't be dry spots.
and what caused the flood?
Huh?
What caused the flood? Was it just heavy rains or what?
Just the rains and the way that the water was being caught. I mean, we all know how sporadic our rains are. I mean, it can be raining here and not be raining somewhere else. So with that being said, you know, there might have been certain areas that had a heavy amount of rain, and then an area might not have any rain at all. And you see that in Monticello.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you try to cross. She'll call me and she'll say, "I can't get across the stream," because she's up Monticello. Yes.
Seems to me that the way the town's laid out between Main Street and Broadway, that Main Street was the main street.
It was.
And Broadway came later.
That's correct.
And perhaps reflecting
Yeah.
the clearing of the
That's-
swamp. So to
That's a
speak.
very good point.
Yeah.
That Main Street was higher, and so it was dry.
Did it ever have another name besides? Was it always Main Street? Or?
It was always Main Street.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And that was when they moved. Then when they moved the town of Palomas Hot Springs to Hot Springs, and about that time, then this hot springs, the mineral baths started showing up out in the low areas. Then they wanted to change the name, and Otto Guest was the first mayor of Hot Springs. And he is the one that said, let's just drop Palomas. He had, and I think there's pictures. Tina, can you check? I think there's pictures. There's a picture in here of him, of Otto Guest. Let me find it real quick. Do you know who what Otto Guest looked like? Vaguely.
Vague, very vague.
Here was my picture of me and my mother with her catfish. That was a record until 1977. Yeah, and she was quite a fisher person. She fished up to 2 weeks till she died. So she did it her way. I can't say it was always that good, but she did it her way. That's my brother. Let's see. In 1935, this is when they started building, like the WPA came in and started building the sidewalks, and they started doing a lot of the groundwork, and the WPA built the convention center, or the recreation center as we know it downtown. And right across the street, which I don't know, it's the county, it's the city manager's office. That was the library. Yeah, that was the library back at that time. Right across the street from the recreation center. And let's see. Here was a good example down here at the bottom of where you can see how low the lake was and where they were, all the fish that were being cleaned.
So that was due to big drought
Huh?
conditions, big drought conditions or whatever.
Yeah, and it comes and goes. And I mean, I chuckle, when I listen to people up in Albuquerque, oh, we're in a drought. They don't know what a drought is. They're moving. I'm sorry, but they're moving. They've got so many people there, and it really, I think New Mexico is going to break down, which we're seeing it already, urban versus rural. And your urban areas are growing, and they want more water, and your rural areas are holding on to whatever they've got, and because it's tough to survive in a rural area. And then of course Ralph Edwards came in. And Ralph Edwards, had the great idea of let's change the name from Hot Springs because there were so many hot springs. Let's change the.
My mother was so angry about that. I was born in 1941, and that's the year that it went over the spillway, and I believe it was for the first time.
I thought that he had a
And my mother was angry too. She was so angry about that. She said, we've got good fishing. We need to keep us what we are. And so, I could argue either side of it. But boy, my mother was angry about that too with the name change,
I thought that he had a contest and that the city, some people in the city decided to enter the contest, and that was how you got the name of that. That's what That's what he told on TV.
Well,
They thought Hollywood was gonna come here and it would be big.
yeah.
Yeah,
They did
because
for a while.
he said he did not change the name, that the people in
They voted.
Truth
Well, they
Accounting-
did the election, and I think they did the election with the idea that there was going to be lots of things that were going to happen. And he promised, and he did. He brought a parade every year until he died. But I mean, have you noticed that the name is just kind of gone away? I mean, you don't hear a lot about Ralph Edwards now.
Didn't they give like $50,000 to any town who would change their name?
Well, he said he was going to give that money, but we could never prove that he actually did.
Oh.
I mean, it was just talk.
Real producer.
Yeah, talk's cheap, right? Yeah.
Yeah, TV celebrity.
And here's an interesting picture here, a Riddle's Drug. A Riddle's Drug was up on Main Street. And here's an example of Riddle's Drug in 1950, where Paul Tooley, who was the Herald, the editor of the Herald, and then there was other people, Dennis, who was the editor of the Advocate. Here they're talking about the name change. They really thought it was going to be something really good for the community, and it ended up going the other way. But maybe it didn't. You know, I think we have to see it all through. Yeah. And let's see.
But one of the big things that was happening though at the time was people who came for healing in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. After World War II, it just drastically changed. Medicine and health became very much a scientific endeavor after the soldiers, and so people stopped healing themselves and they turned to doctors, whereas that was just not the habit for most families unless there was really an urgent injury. So some of that. So there was just, you know, that fear of losing that stronghold, and trying to figure out, and I think people were really trying to figure out, because for the first time in about the 1950s, you saw some of that population starting to hold, because it had just been such steady growth. And I think people were really looking for a new way to sort of set themselves to brand. You know, it was branding way back in the day.
And I think in the 60s there was a big push then, you know, lots of pictures were in the paper with fish. And so in the 60s there was a push for Elephant Butte Dam about getting away from the hot springs, and a lot of the hot springs fell in disrepair. And I know that, you know, my horse drugged me and I was all beat up and I went down and laid in the pool. But I tell you, you know, I can remember then, that was like 1967. And I can remember thinking, you know, I don't know if I want to be in here or not. Because you didn't know what, you know, we really didn't understand a lot of the germs that are coming out that we know today and how they can be passed, especially that warm temperature of the water. Now, you know, so many of the baths, you know, they dump the water, they put clean water in. I mean, they clean the area. So, you know, it's all been more high. Well, they made it cleaner. You know, they homogenized, making it all much cleaner. So, okay. Well, I don't know. How are we doing for time?
You still got a little bit of time.
Okay. Any other questions?
Well, I know that the men that were building the dam came here to drink, and I think there was gambling here too. So can you tell us a little bit about the gambling and maybe any other pursuits?
Okay, what did you say, Tita?
Gambling. Who wants to know about the gambling?
Oh,
the prostitution.
Oh, the
and
gambling.
other pursuits, yes.
The other vice.
I just said pursuits.
He said pursuits, yes. What other pursuits entertain?
Well, gambling. My mother was a gambler. My mother was a gambler, and so I can remember sitting, and you know, you have to remember there were like 26 bars here. And I was always, and you jump in at any time, you know. I can remember with all the bars, you know, that, you know, wow. I mean, it was just like, there was just so much going on. And I was laying there in bed this morning thinking, well, now wait a minute, where did my mother work? For Bonnie, which was down on Broadway, and she worked for Bessie, which was Bonnie's sister, and they was across the street. And they all had a special room that they would go into, and they would gamble. And then when the police, and there was one document, I think it's in here, where they shut down they shut down the gambling. The state police came in and they shut down the gambling, and then they started doing it in their homes. So it went from the taverns to the homes. And I can remember, and one memory that I have, and I guess maybe that's why, we end up being, every generation ends up being like, you kind of go along and you think, well, my mother was this, but then I'm going to be a straight shooter. You end up being a straight shooter because of what's going on. I can remember one time my mother was gambling at the house, and the guy didn't have the money. She won. The guy didn't have the money, so he gave her a check. Did I tell you this? He gave her a check. And so I was always getting car sick. And so she had to go to Silver City early that morning to cash that check. So she went across the mountain, and when she was coming out of the bank, I'm sitting in the car, green because of she drove like a banshee, over the mountain. And exactly, back and forth, and anyway, I remember sitting in the car, and she walked out, and the gentleman was going in to stop payment on the check. And she walked by, and she goes, "Gotcha." And I thought, he's going to kill her. And I just all I remember was just sliding down in the seat going, it was just crazy. But, that was the sign of the times. My mother was born in 1920, and she, and I've often wondered, her and my dad got run out of Kansas for bootlegging. And so they ended up coming down here where it was legal. And then they got down here, and then they stopped doing it down here. And my mother tried to straighten up, or she did. I think she did. Maybe she never did. It's not my mother. She straightened up.
She would go to the casino.
She's probably up there right now.
With my uncle.
You said it was legal here?
Huh?
Or it was legal here, or it was just done here?
Gambling, was it ever legal?
The bootlegging,
Well, at that time, it wasn't legal,
No.
but they were doing it anyway.
Okay.
The mayor of TRC, Leo Smith, had a gambling place in that 2-story building on Foch Street.
Right.
Where my dad and his brothers were.
And they were all gambling, and they
And
were all
also there's a lot of
they were all
Santa Fe people.
bootlegging, and so that's what. Because I asked my mom, and my dad. I said, "Why did you move here of all places?" Well, we could gamble and we could make our booze, and
And there were a lot of people from Santa Fe who would stop on the way down south. I mean, this was a very popular place I heard some great stories when I was doing my dissertation work about, just the governors and the secretary of states and the people who would stop to gamble and have a little fun on the way to hit El Paso and Las Cruces.
And what you have to realize is that, and this is true today, if you look at from Socorro north, there's one set of standards and there's one lifestyle, and then you get into what they call the borderlands in the south, and it's like, whoa. I mean, it's like, you can't believe, we've often talked about this. Why did they break New Mexico when they decided to make it a state in 1912? Why did they pick the profile that they picked, they meaning the powers to be, to put this in New Mexico? Because it makes more sense if it would be cut from Socorro down and Socorro up than from the way it is now. Because, we're even seeing that in politics. And you look at our previous governor, Suzanne Martinez, and the trouble that she's continuing to have about the things going on, the things that allegedly happened, whether they did or not. I guess it'll come out in court. But again, she was from the South, different world than the North. That's a good question.
Yeah, my house is part of the original town site, and my neighbor who's no longer alive, Dan Tafoya, was here when they would take a wagon down to get water and bring it back up, for bathing, whatever. And he was quite interesting. It's a shame we couldn't have gotten more history out of him. He goes way back,
That's right. Yeah. It's just, and I tell you, we're so blessed to be able to have people that still remember some things that are not, that can remember. I know I started, and I highly recommend the book To My Children's Children. You can buy it online. at Amazon, or you can get it. But in that book, it talks about you're writing a story to your children. And back in the 90s, the early 90s, I took that book and I started asking my mother questions about, like, what was the color of your room? And tell me about what you did in a school day, and so on and so forth. I mean, those are just some questions. But it's to my children's children. And it's a wonderful book about preserving that history. Because if we don't preserve it, then we don't remember what happened. And everybody in this room has a story to tell. And so we all need to be thinking about what our memories are, because things have changed a lot.
Would you like me to pass these around for people who have questions? We've got pens.
Can we just
We've got
say them out loud?
papers, and that way.
If anybody has any other questions, I'll be glad to answer them afterwards. So, okay.
Do you want to say anything about, like, things today? How many feelings you have about where the town is, where it's come to, or where it's going, in your opinion?
Well, I really don't know. I think that, I'm of the opinion that what we really have to be looking at is urban versus rural, and I don't know where that's going to go. I understand why people leave here, and I think we have a horrible drug problem, and I don't know how we're going to stand and get a handle on that. But I think that the question that we really need to be thinking about is, how do, so many people that I know, the school districts they're losing population. The town, this county is dead last in all the, and so why is that? And I think that probably there needs to be some thinking about, and giving it some time about thinking about what can they do to turn things around. And even people in Socorro are working in Albuquerque or Belen or Los Lunas. They may drive 63 miles. I noticed that on TV now, that they talk about, it'll be X number of minutes from Socorro to Albuquerque, or X number of minutes from Socorro to Belen. And so, it's too hard. I know Tina drove down from Albuquerque today, and it's probably pushing, 3-hour drive or 2-hour drive to get down here. So, that's quite a ways.
I have a question about the water going down the river.
Uh-huh.
How much longer before we actually get to keep some of it? Because we've been coming down here since the early 80s, late 70s. There was a whole lot more water back then. Granted, the drought and whatnot, but.
Well, and I think, again, you have to go back and look at the contracts that they have about how many acre feet, and then they have credits and debits. So where I would recommend I don't have an opinion about it, because the whole water issue, I have a solution, but I don't think it'll ever come to that. But I think that you have to look at the credits and the debits, and then if the water is owned by the farmers, then how much water do they need, and then the water goes on down, and it goes on into Texas, and it goes on into the Gulf, it goes into Mexico. And then if they have an agreement that they want so many thousand acre feet a year, and then they've been working on a debit credit system, that really is going to all have to be worked out with lawyers, people that have bigger brains than I have. And I think that's going to.
We still owe them a certain.
Yeah, they're doing everything by the book because people are watching them. Yeah. And how many of you know where Mims's Pond is?
Mims
Pond?
Okay.
Mims Pond,
Well, we own Mims's Pond. My husband and I own that, and we own about 100 acres of that pond. We don't own it all, but we own about 100 acres of that pond. And I think what is interesting about that is that I became fascinated with when was that cut off? Because that used to be the old river flow,
right.
and now they straightened out that oxbow, so the water just shoots straight on down, and again it goes back to delivering that water south.
So what happened to the water this year there?
Yeah, it dried up.
It just totally dried up there.
What now?
It dried up. that
Lack of
pond.
snowpack.
Well, but again, you've got credits and debits. I mean, if it's like the bank, if you borrow money from the bank, you're going to have to pay it back, and that's what they're saying about the water. And those dry years when you don't have the water, then you take the water that you have coming to you. But then on the years that it's wet, then maybe you can make some of that up.
But I'm at Mims Pond, it just suddenly was like no water.
I can't hear what you're
Oh, Mims Pond, what was
And
happening
last year
with
the
Mims
water
Pond
just
when the water
was
dried
gone.
up
Well,
last year?
yeah, I asked about that. We've hired a water guru up in Berlin and Los Lunas to work on that. And what they found out was that they hit a spring when they were digging out the riverbed, and that drained Mims's Pond. But
But it's coming back.
right.
Yeah.
But then when we got ready to file a lawsuit, they turned around then and filled it back up, and now the pond's coming back up.
Yeah, Sherry and Baxter have done some remarkable restoration and birds habitat. I mean, they're doing the kind of work that I think that critically and desperately needs to happen on a larger scale in the county and in the state. That kind of work that's going to ensure that there's just some resilience, and so, they're doing things to really ensure the sustainability. And and I know that Sharon and I have talked about this a lot. Those connections between the hot water here and the larger water ecosystem. Like digging that and suddenly the pond's dry, and getting a better sense of how those things are connected and paying attention to some of the really good work that's going on in terms of the research.
Okay, I have two real quick questions. It says, does TRC and Elephant Meat cooperate to work to promote the area? I think, I would like to see more, but I think that they have tried, but, maybe not enough. So, they're going to, they have different agendas. You've got the people that come in at Elephant Butte Lake, and they want to have fun. And then you have people that come here to the hot springs, and maybe they have different directions that they need to go. So that would be a good point, and I think that who would take a lead on that one would be the county, since they're both in the county. But I was a county commissioner, and again, it's a dicey world we live in. And so, you have different people that have strong opinions about things sitting on those boards, and when you try to work through those things, those issues, saying, look, let's all work together, because if we don't, we're all gonna suffer. So, with that being said, yeah, they do need to cooperate, and there needs to be an outside source come in and bring that cooperation together. The other thing, suggestion for growth to TRC. A suggestion, build a 2-year college and a trade school. Well, I think that we tried, when we had the alternative school, we had such a high dropout rate, and Truth or Consequences Municipal School District is dead last. I mean, if you look for yourself, if you go to the PED website, public education website, it shows where the standing is of the Truth or Consequences School District. And so most of the people in this room probably don't have children in the schools. Now, I know you have Imogen, but Imogen's in Albuquerque, and she's going to a gifted school. And so, the question is that why do people move here? What do they want? And are they willing to invest in a trade school? Are they willing to invest in a 2-year college? And I think those are the questions that have to be asked. Again, those would be good questions to bring into the collaboration between Elephant Butte and TRC.
Yeah, we lose our youth here. Mine grew up, they went to college,
Yeah.
somewhere else for jobs.
Yeah. Well,
there's not enough of the tax base here to support extra schools
Right.
or better schools.
and that's and that's where we really need to be thinking about what we need. Yeah.
Well, like the empty shopping center up there. When you see vacant buildings not being used, you wonder, well, how could we put that big
Yeah.
structure to
Yeah.
use?
Can I ask one more question?
Uh-huh.
How much property in the city itself does Fletcher own?
How much?
Just an odd
How much
question.
In the
property
city?
rent?
Mm.
Yeah, how much does Ted Turner own in TRC
Uh,
of the city?
You know, I can't answer that question.
No.
He owns the Water Ranch,
Right.
and he owns the Armendaris,
Right.
which is about 600,000 acres. So it's a pretty significant.
Yeah, I was just curious.
Here in
about the city.
TRC,
Well, what
he
about
owns
here
the
in
Sierra
TRC?
Grande
Yeah.
election.
And Sierra
Sierra
Grande.
Grande.
He's
Yeah,
one of the
you're
biggest
right,
landowners.
you're right.
And on another note, I've lived here all my life. I raised 4 daughters,
You know.
and they're out of this community. We have had doctors, nurses, actors. We've had good people come from this community. Everybody has to make their own choice. And these people that are dealing and with the drugs and taking them, that's too bad.
Well, it's nationwide, it's not just.
That's
it's
right.
nationwide.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to do a little check-in here, and I told Sherry we would be done at 12 o'clock, so she's paced herself and had lots of questions, and I want to go back to a point you made a couple paragraphs ago, and that's about how important it is to hear our stories. And that's what this series is about, and I hope, again, thank you all coming to this. I hope you see the value of it. We do it once a month. Our guest next month, hopefully, will be Jenny Chavez, who's here today with her daughter, Pam. And again, thank you, Sherry, so much. I mean, we'll have to have you come back again sometime later this year again, because there's so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.